All right, it's a pleasure to be here. My name's Ian. I'm an investor at Fabric. You've just heard from my colleague Max. We're a European Web3 fund covering everything across the space, but Max and I spend most of our time on media and entertainment, so hence gaming. Some of the notable investments you might know are stuff like SoRare, Immutable, Sky Mavis, among others. Now, I've played games all my life. I am a gamer through and through. I think many of you, or at least since I've been able to play games, I think about 3 years old, just about reaching the keyboard and mouse to play Quake. But unlike many of you, I think many of you have just built games as well as played them. So first of all, thank you for that. But secondly, if anything I say here disagrees with your experiences in the games industry, I'm here to learn. So please come find me afterwards, let me know, let's chat about it. I'm always here to chat games. So has anyone listened to Gamecraft by Mitch Lasky and Blake Robbins? Yep, a couple people. Highly recommend, benchmark folks, very strong in gaming. One of the premises when they explained the last 30 years of gaming was the perhaps surprising conclusion that actually games haven't changed that much, gameplay, that is. Of course, this is true for things like chess, Go, other board games, but it's also true in video games. If I think through some of the games I've enjoyed most, try and spot the difference between Halo Combat Evolved, that was released in 2001, and Halo Infinite, which was released in 2021. Okay, you've got some more pixels, you've got a different aspect ratio, maybe more detailed textures, but ultimately, fundamentally, the gameplay is pretty similar, even down to the UI. And if you compare this to another consumer vertical, something like banking, well, 20 years ago, a brick-and-mortar banking experience, or even the very early sort of grassroots of online banking, it's pretty different to just pulling out your phone and you have a neobank right there in your pocket. So you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, the games industry hasn't really been innovating that much. It looks fundamentally the same. But what has changed in that time, in 2 decades, in 3 console generations, is the business model. 20 years ago, if you wanted to play Combat Evolved, you went into a store and you bought a physical disc in a box and you brought that home. If you want to play Infinite, well, you download it takes maybe an hour, and straight away you can jump into a game. After that is, you close the pop-up that asks you to spend 20 bucks to buy the Mark V Spartan skin to look like the original Master Chief. So clearly there's a huge change in the business model. And this is the conclusion that actually it's not necessarily the gameplay that has created most of the value or disrupted the games industry as much as it is changing business models. So let's look at a few. Of course, the shift from arcade to console, they coexisted for 20, 30 years, but into the 90s, and I've showed the PlayStation here, by the time that 3D graphics had got significantly good in your home console, there wasn't really a need to go to the arcade anymore. And so from a consumer value proposition, buying the game once and playing it as many times as you like, that's so much stronger than paying every single time you want to have a session. Into the 2000s, and Steam released by Valve. Originally, it was just to update your first-party Valve games, but then soon it became what we now know today as a platform-based publisher, and the leading way to download games. So this digital distribution actually reduces the barrier to entry for a developer. Beforehand, if you wanted to get a game out there, you had to spend 6, maybe even 7 figures physically manufacturing these disks. Whereas now, you can just upload your software, and anyone can download it. Your cost of goods is almost nothing. At the same time, free-to-play was developing as a business model. And really into the late 2000s, into the 2010s, it became the dominant way, especially for mobile. And this reduced the barrier to entry, not for developers, but for gamers. How do I know I'm going to enjoy a game before I spend 50 bucks on it? Well, I can immediately just download a game and try it. That opens up your audience to so many more players, but it reintroduces this price elasticity. 50 bucks plus an expansion is not the maximum you spend anymore. It's 100, 200, 1,000. And so this is a way to capture so much more value from an even wider audience. If we plot this over time, and many of you have probably seen this graph before, it shows the annual global gaming revenue as covered over time split between platforms. And we look at certain shifts in business model. So the introduction of sufficiently good and cheap home console hardware, you see the demise of arcade and consoles filling that gap. then the introduction of digital distribution of software, and just the growth of the games industry from, call it something around 50 billion, not that much more than in the 80s and 90s. And if you chart this all the way to today, it's somewhere between 200 and 300 billion. And then finally, the app stores and mobile gaming, which, as we know, dominates about 50% of the industry today. It's elsewhere as well. It's the distribution of video content via YouTube by gamers. It's the adoption of telecommunications and online communications, Ventrilo, TeamSpeak back in the early 2000s. All of these shifts are not just shifts in business model for the games industry, they're actually more indicative of broader cultural shifts as enabled by technology. And this is something that gaming has been brilliant at. It pioneers these new technologies and these new ways that we live. So what's the next shift? Well, we believe it's the sovereign ownership of our data, our identity, our assets. What does that mean for games? Well, it means player-owned assets. That is ways that developers can build these complex financial systems on top of their games, but without worrying about the infrastructure, more importantly, the compliance overheads, because you can leverage existing custody, marketplaces, DeFi, the blockchain as a transaction and settlement layer. So what? We've got a new business model. Games still have to be fun, right? Of course, I don't mean to trivialize any of the developments in the last 20 years of games. But if you actually look at where new genres, new types of games have come from, more often than not, they find their history in modding. So of course, Counter-Strike 2, back through Global Offensive, Source 1.6, 5, 4, etc., was originally a mod of Half-Life. Half-Life was built on the Quake engine. Quake bore the mod Team Fortress, which became Team Fortress 2, and from that we got Overwatch, Valorant, other tactical shooters. MOBAs like League and Dota 2, well, they come from the eponymous Defense of the Ancients, which was built in the Warcraft 3 world editor. And battle royales like Apex, like Fortnite, like Warzone, they were actually all the way go back to DayZ, a mod of Arma 2. And actually after that, PUBG was a mod of Arma 3. And around the same time, there were Minecraft servers running battle royale type games. So in all of these cases, billions of dollars of value have been created by these new genres and these new games. But the modders, the core developers of the original growth of the new genre, they at best got a job. The Team Fortress developers joined Valve. Yule and IceFrog, who worked on Defense of the Ancient, joined Valve as well to do Dota 2. Is that fair compensation for creating billions of dollars of value, just a job, earning 6 figures a year? I don't think so. So what can we do about that? Well, so far we've examined one property of blockchains, that's sovereign ownership. But there's another, which is the permissionless nature of smart contracts. And more than that, the open source nature of the Web3 development community. So with that, we have permissionless development. That is, being able to build on the logic of others without having to have explicit permission, without worrying about the reprimand of an end-user license agreement. Through this, hopefully, we can align incentives better to encourage modding, to supercharge this sorts of activity. And not just encourage it, but actually give rewards proportional to the activity, to the value that you create in a programmatic way. Now, this is a topic where there's some brilliant folks here who are going to speak about it later. We've got Justin from Lattice and Terrence from Cartridge, so I'll leave it there for now. But we've got these two concepts, permissionless development and player-owned assets. If we put them together, well, we can achieve something that Mitch and Blake refer to as the forever game. That is, a game that doesn't have an end. It constantly provides new ways to engage, new forms of achievement. And from a venture perspective, it's one of the opportunities that I see as having the most venture scale, the most opportunity for the sort of outcome that we're looking for. And they have 5 key properties. That is balance, eventfulness, competition, player investment, and community. We could talk about all of them, but I'm just going to focus on 2 for the sake of time. So player-owned assets, that has fairly clear relationship to player investment. If you own your assets, you care more about it. You're going to be more engaged. it's always good to put numbers to it. So as an example, one of our portfolio companies saw roughly 5 to 10x increase in engagement, retention, monetization for the players that owned the assets as opposed to just regular players. Now, of course, this is something you can achieve in Web 2 as well. You can make players input resources, either their time or investment. But by having this overtly financial link to the assets, the belief is that this becomes stronger than just a psychological connection. And then more than just an individual being invested in the game, if you have a whole community who are aligned by having shared assets, well, they'll want to see the game grow together. That forms a group of hyper-evangelical marketers. And if you know that your player base want to see the game grow and do well then you can give more governance. You can let them do dispute resolution. You can give them more powers. That's where permissionless development really comes and supercharges community to another level. Throughout the history of MMOs in particular, but many games, the game is not built in a vacuum, in isolation. As soon as the community get their hands on it, it changes. And that infers the way that the developer then builds. Going back to, if anyone knows the story from the beta of Ultima Online and the assassination of Lord British, exploits and the impact of the community on the game affects the way that the developer develops it. And Hilmar's going to talk later about his experience with EVE Online and how a critical role community plays for them. So instead of having these exploits, these problems, be fires for the developer to try and put out, if you turn it into a sort of metagame, that contributes to the eventfulness of the whole system. We can really look towards open source software development, and the Linux kernel was mentioned. So Eric Raymond wrote an essay entitled The Cathedral and the Bazaar in 1997, and he later wrote a book as well. In it, he describes the two competing ways to develop software in that development of the Linux kernel. One, he termed the cathedral, this way in which between releases, it's closed source. You have only a few select developers are allowed to look at, or allowed to bug fix the code. And then the other, the bazaar, it's open source. Anyone can look. And his core thesis was that by having the maximum number of developers be able to contribute to this code, any bug becomes shallow and anything can become fixed in the fastest way. And I think that really aligns very well with what we've seen in the modding community in games, and how this can supercharge the development of a game as a whole. Even in something as brilliant as Baldur's Gate 3. I know I've put hundreds of hours this year into it. It's going to win all the Game of the Year awards. It already has won a few. Larian Studio, 7 years, hundreds of developers, brilliant game. But within days of release, now that you have thousands of gamers looking at it, we had so many mods that fixed the movement, the camera, more textures, the inventory system. And the game was immediately made even better. So I'm going to leave one last comment here to say that by empowering this decentralized collective of developers and gamers, the bazaar, we can achieve so much more than if we just look to the central cathedral for all the answers. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to connect, that's my Twitter. If you want to see the full Fabric thesis from 2017, that goes to the Fabric Medium. And shortly, I'll be posting our full gaming thesis afterwards as well. Thank you. There's a few minutes for questions, if there are any, but I'll happily just come find me and we'll chat afterwards either. All good? No problem. Thanks so much.